Item number 6 is the role of the chairperson of the Housing Agency and related matters, in particular on the recently articulated views on homelessness in Ireland. At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. I would like to welcome Mr. Conor Skehan from the Housing Agency to our meeting today, but just before we begin I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only the evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Just before we begin, Mr. Skehan, in our private session we agreed to do this in 3 sections if we're under pressure with time. So in order with your opening statement we would take it under the Housing Agency and the roles that they have under that. Next would be your role as chairperson, and then the 3rd section would be your recent articulated views. So I'm hoping that members will adhere to that where possible. So I'd like to call on Mr. Skehan to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you very much, members. Cathaoirleach. Just very briefly, just to thank you for the invitation to present here today. The opening statement I've given just sets out the fact that I was appointed chair in 2013 and that the agency currently has 64 staff with an annual budget of 114 million. It deals with a very wide range of issues. I've given detailed descriptions in an attachment, but just to remind people that what we deal with is housing supply services, supporting local authorities in housing management, conducting research, supporting approved housing bodies, operating the regional mortgage to rent scheme, the national mortgage to rent scheme, coordinating national housing policy for people with disability, providing procurement advice and support to local authorities and AHBs, operating the pyrite remediation scheme, regulating the approved housing bodies and providing advice about a big wide range of issues including policy development, technical advice and project management. So we've been very vigorous and very active, and as I said, I've given you an attachment showing what the role of that, the extent of that work is. In my own role as chair, I lead a team, the board, who set the strategy and oversee the implementation of the agency's activities. The roles are guided by our published vision, the missions and values, which identify independent influence, quality expertise, innovation and solution-focused, and respected reputation and collaboration as our core values. They're also attached in detail. One of my roles as chair is to periodically meet with the Minister of the Department in order to discuss our performance. It's my practice at such meeting to advise the Minister about housing issues and priorities, usually the first time I meet a new Minister, and I've given a typical such briefing from our perspective in Appendix 4. And then in my role, since I started, the agency has expanded its scope and scale considerably over that period. Again, there's an attachment setting out how much that's grown. That, in fact, is the reason that I notified the Minister in 2016 that I would not be available for reappointment, because of my belief that the continued expansion of the agency would demand a chair with deeper skills in financial and HR management than I possess. To this end, I instigated and implemented a succession programme that resulted in the Public Appointment Service identifying and recommending replacements, which proved to be unavailable when offered the position. As a result of this, I agreed in December last to continue the role until the replacement could be appointed. The Minister assures me that's proceeding as quickly as possible. So in the matter of homelessness and my recent comments to the media in the matter, just to draw your attention to the fact that prior to stepping down as chair, I agreed to give one press exit interview. The interview took place on the 2nd of December. It lasted about 2 hours and covered the topics, or about the topic of what I'd learned in the last 5 years. Once it emerged that I wasn't going to be stepping down, I let the journalists know that I wouldn't be doing so. The Irish Times subsequently published 6 articles based on that interview over a period of 2 weeks, which is the matter that I understand this meeting to discuss. The matters, as I understand them, are my reported views on the following aspects of homelessness. The first being that there are too many homeless charities. The second being that homelessness is normal. The third, that people may be gaming the system. The fourth, that there is a need for vigilance about housing numbers. The fifth, that homelessness is a result of affordability. The next is that the attention to vacancies in arrears should be given higher priority. And the last is that housing behaviour by millennials is affecting supply. I'm happy to discuss this and any other topics that I may be directed to do so by yourself and by the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Skeen. And first person is Senator Victor Boyne.
I just want a bit of guidance, Cathaoirleach. I mean, is this just, we can ask any questions at this point, or are you going to take it into three different sections?
I'd like to take it into three sections so we
they're
can really
slightly
get
all
into detail.
intertwined, really, and so, I mean, I'm short, and I'm happy to wait my turn then, but I mean, what I have to say mostly is in relation, it relates to the statement that you've clearly mixed all the issues in here yourself, and I was hoping maybe just to comment.
Maybe even if you ask the questions in that order.
Well, in that order, first I want to thank you for coming here, Mr. Skeen, and I do appreciate that. Secondly, I just want to go through them in a sort of order as they came to me here. A lot of it hinges really on your interview. You say, mind you, here that you gave one exit interview. I read a number of press clippings, and I'm saying they're necessary interviews. We gave a very extensive one to the Sunday Business Post, clearly in the Irish Times. There was a lot of interviews, so I just don't quite get this one interview. But anyway...
We have to be very specific.
Yeah.
There was one interview.
Okay.
And that's a very important point, because we have an enormous amount of commentary here, which is based on the outcome of a single interview. And what's going to be very important, and I'm going to stress it a number of times this afternoon, is the importance to understand that the statements that are being reported repeatedly are the results of a single interview and a single aspect of a single comment, which I'm going to come back to again and again.
Could I be let finish? And
of course you can, yes.
So therefore, you've given, it has been reported that some comments, so I'm going to single out some of these comments, and then you can comment on them when I'm finished. You've given a series of interviews, as my understanding. You targeted homeless charities. You said there was too many of them. You commented in relation, again, I'm open to correction. This is a due process here, and I would like you to correct me if I'm wrong when I'm finished. You talk about the Apollo activists and I'm understanding your quote as saying they were misguided, and I want to know why you think that, and you still think that. And you have said that the homeless crisis is normal. Again, this is my understanding of your commentary, and I have read and played back some of your commentary, and this is what I've taken from it. You said that people are gaming the system, declaring homeless in order to get priority on the housing list. And that may or may not be the case. I'm not disputing. I just want to tease it out with you. You might also reference government policy. I mean, there was a certain amount of government policy that said people that were homeless were to be prioritised. There was to be quotas in each of the local authorities. So I just wanted, gaming the system. A lot of people found that very offensive. A lot of people discussed it with me and said they found that exceptionally offensive. That somebody in your responsibility, was saying that people were gaming the system. And I'd like to know when it came to your attention when they gamed the system, and what did you do about it if you thought that was the case. And your name became a byword, really. I suppose in some way your name became a byword for the idea, and I think this is important, the idea that there's an official indifference to the human cost of homelessness. That's what some people thought. So I really want to wrap up. I'm not here to argue with you. I just want to pass on what I picked out. I found your remarks offensive. People, and I'm not without a home. I met people who were homeless, people in hostels, people who worked in the sector found it offensive, particularly in your position. And I really want to ask you, firstly, to clarify if you did say those comments. And clearly, if you did say them, you gave a lot of thought to it. You're not a man. I would have a lot of respect for you. I've attended conferences where you've addressed. Clearly, you would have given some thought to that. And do you still stand over them? And if so, are you fit even to stay in office at this particular juncture? That's just a view of mine. And I'd like you to, and finally to wrap up, did the minister summon you in, the current minister, and express some concern about the comments that you made?
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Skeen.
Would you like me to take all of this set?
If that's suits you, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much. Well, look, first of all, thank you very much, Senator, for the opportunity to clarify these, because this indeed is the essence of the issue, as to what I did or did not say. So to get to the heart of the matter and the extent to which people have said to you that they find what I said was objectionable, hurtful or insulting, I think if you read what I actually said, it's the following. I said that there may be an issue and that should be investigated. At the risk of false flattery, I would continually draw your attention to the wisdom that you continually are told in this committee by Deputy O'Brien of the importance of having policy based on evidence, the avoidance of anecdote, the avoidance of emotion. Am I correctly paraphrasing you? And the importance of doing that rests on a systematic analysis of whether things that are reputed by many people to be taking place are or are not in fact true. So if I'm arriving into this committee, Cathaoirleach, I'm arriving in to say to you that one of the really important pieces of work that this committee have got to do is to find out if these things are true or not. And I have been, as you say, Senator, extremely careful in my words not to say that these things are happening. I'm saying that they may be happening and they should be investigated. And to take it further, I'd like to draw your attention to the following two phrases that have appeared at the same time. There may well be a small proportion of people gaming the system, but there have been chancers since time began. Look at insurance fraud, for instance. If it's happening, I'm certain it's a tiny proportion. Or the following statement, Senator. No matter what you have, whether it's a social welfare system or a tax system or a housing system, some people will try to scam the system. That's just a reality. I'm absolutely sure there are some families who are declaring themselves homeless when they may not actually be homeless in order to jump the queue. And that's a tiny, tiny percentage of those families who are actually declaring themselves homeless. Now, Senator, the first of those remarks is by Mr. David Hall, the Irish Mortgage Holders Association, as reported in the Irish Independent, and I will provide the committee with the specific reference to that article. The second one, describing people who are trying to scam the system, is by Father Peter McVeary. These are exactly the same pieces of advice that I provided when I said this may be happening. People may be doing this. If it's happening, it should be investigated. They're the actual words, and I know you're a busy committee. I'm not going to be tedious enough to reread the article out to you, but I think it's extremely important that we understand that that's the context. Now, to go back to your other point, does that answer that part of your question as to what I actually said?
That's your view. Yeah.
No. Senator, I do not deal in views. I'm here to report facts. These are facts. These are facts. These are facts as reported by extremely reputable commentators on this issue who are saying exactly the same thing word for word. Are we clear about that? Are we clear about that?
We have a Cathaoirleach and we have a chairperson.
I might ask you, Mr.
And there's a process how we engage and we don't.
If you're asking me a question, you have to accept the answer all the way through.
No, I don't
I might
have to do
ask you,
anything.
whatever you reference, that you might send it on to the committee afterwards.
I will, of course. I will, of course, Cathaoirleach. So that's the matter of gaming the system or otherwise. That's the matter of people taking offence at the things I've said or otherwise. Is that completely clear where that's come from and where that's going? In terms of the questions asked about describing homelessness as normal, one of the really important things, again, going back, sorry, I'm going to keep picking on you, Deputy O'Brien, I'll stop now. One of the really important things for this committee to do is to base policy and decisions on evidence. One of the most normal things done in all fields of human endeavour, and particularly in the field of public policy, is to benchmark, to know how we are doing compared to other things, other places and other sectors. Saying that our homeless issues are normal is a call to examine the ratio of people who are homeless in various different categories in Ireland, compared first of all to other European member states, secondly to other European member states of similar circumstances, and third to do so in the context of homelessness in other parts of the world. That's what normal means. So the calling of people to recognise the levels of homelessness in Ireland, which, again, using the complete statement, I stated that homelessness is a dreadful thing to befall anybody, But we must recognise it goes on everywhere in the world. And it goes on everywhere in the world for more or less the same mix of reasons. And it is only by examining that and seeing it in that context can you, start to direct the Oireachtas' attention towards policies that are likely to be effective, as opposed to those that are merely based on anecdote and emotion. That's the point of drawing attention to that. I can't read my scrawly handwriting, so I've forgotten or overlooked something of what you've asked. Senator, forgive me. I've talked about normal, I've talked about gaming the system, I've talked about people taking offence. Oh yes, did the Minister summon me to express his displeasure? On the contrary. The Minister made a public statement that people like chairs are appointed and valued for the provision of independent advice which, as he said, he may or may not agree with. But that's our role, particularly in an agency that are specifically mandated to be independent, to tell people what they need to hear, which may not always be what they want to hear. Does that answer your question, Senator?
Senator Boyne, is there any other clarifications you would like?
No, I suppose you still clearly, you might just confirm in a word, do you still stand over these comments?
I stand over the comments that these issues, the issues to do with people describing themselves as homeless in order to obtain advantage on the housing waiting list, that there appears to be a body of evidence that that's taking place. And I'm saying to you, as the responsible committee, that you should investigate this.
Mr. Skeen, if you have evidence of that, you might send that on to the committee.
I'll do more than
the
that,
committee
yes.
then can look into that. Is that okay with the committee?
Just to say, I have to go, unfortunately, because the housing is in the Senate. As you can imagine, Minister English is there, and I've undertaken to speak on that. So, thank you very much. And
thank you, Mr. Senator, and thank you very much for the opportunity to clarify this. It's a very important thing for me to have had that opportunity.
I agree.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Victor. Deputy O'Byrne.
Thanks very much, Chair, and Conor, thanks very much for coming in. And I suppose just a couple of initial comments. First of all, I'm a strong defender of free speech, and I think people have a right to express their opinions and their views, and I wouldn't try and curtail that. But I suppose, likewise, the rest of us have a right to respond to those publicly. And I also think people in public bodies should express those views, even when they don't necessarily coincide with politicians in opposition or in government. Having said all that, it is my view, and when I commented on all of this publicly over the Christmas and the New Year, I tried to be very measured in my remarks, and I tried to be as accurate in commenting on what you actually said as opposed to what some other people then misreported you as saying, so I have no difficulty with your description. But there is a difference between, in my opinion, yourself and David Hall and Peter McVerry, in the sense that you chair a body who are tasked with providing independent and evidence-based research to government. Your body is very influential, and on the particular issue of potential strategic presenters into the homeless system, your organisation has been very influential in influencing a very significant decision of government. So that makes things that you or other members of the agency, whether on the board or staff members, particularly significant in that context, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me make two initial responses, however, to two of the comments you made. I happen to think there are too many homeless organisations. There are lots of people in the homeless sector who think there are too many homeless organisations. I suppose part of the reason for that is because the failure of the state, in many respects, for a long period of time, meant that the voluntary sector, often charities and religious organisations, had to step in and provide those services. But you made another comment in relation to voluntary service providers, where you were saying that they should have performance indicators. They already have performance indicators. Their service level agreements require them to do that. And in fact, the reporting requirements have become very, very onerous. So I want to put that on the record, because that is an important, I think, for people in the voluntary sector that I spoke to, they had no great difficulty with you commenting on the number. I mean, we have over 40 homeless service providers in the city and county of Dublin. It was the specific issue of performance indicators, which are there, and in fact we've just had revelations that another state agency was trying to put in additional elements to their service level agreements, which would have been detrimental to all of this. On the issue of normal, my view is this: normal, as I understand the word, has a tendency to mean something that's not exceptional. That's something that's a normal way of doing things, or common, or typical. And while there's no doubt that every society has homelessness, or certainly every modern industrial society has homelessness, the levels of homelessness that we've experienced in recent years, particularly child homelessness, are exceptional. And that's not my view, that's the view of the FIANCA study, the cross-country comparison. It's the view of the OECD study. So the concern many of us had when the word normal was used was it sounded like there was a suggestion that this wasn't exceptional and this was typical. If your intention was to say homelessness is a problem in lots and lots of places, and therefore on that basis it's not unusual here, I have no difficulty with that. But that's not the way it came across in the particular interview. And for some people, and I was one of these, it sounded like, you know, like the old Christian saying of poverty is always with us, we should just accept it. And I know that's not your view, but I suppose I'd just like to convey to you that is how that came across in that interview on that radio station at that time, and that caused some difficulties. On the issue of the people may be gaming the system, and look, most of us in this room have done lots of interviews, and we've come out of interviews unhappy the way in which our phrases have been presented. Sometimes we come out kicking ourselves at our choice of words. You know, we don't all get it right all the time, and I accept that, particularly in a 2-hour-long interview. Here's my specific concern with this, and this is why I did feel after that incident that you had crossed a line in your position as chair. And I say that as somebody, and I'm on public record as saying this, has a lot of respect for you, has a good relationship with you, and believe you contribute positively to our housing debate. The Housing Agency did do a study of this very issue at the government's request when they were reviewing the 50% priority allocation. And I read the report unofficially back then, and I read the report when I got it through FOI. And while it says that people may be gaming the system, it says that this may be an issue, it says that there is anecdotal evidence, it presents no evidence whatsoever to support the idea that it is actually happening now in our housing system. That is a report that your body produced and that you are aware of. But also there has been a very, very considered discussion inside the Dublin local authorities, inside the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive and with your body about this issue for a year. So what surprised me was not that you said this at the start of 2016, but given that this research was done and there was no evidence provided, given that we've had this debate, given that, for example, the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, have they subsequently said publicly, do not believe that people are getting through the system as a result of strategically presenting, I thought it was a very unwise comment to even suggest people may be doing it. And the reason why is because it plays into a narrative that is out there in the public. You're not the fault of this narrative, but that these people aren't genuine. These people are just queue jumpers. These people are just trying to get into a council house quicker. And I know you presented your remark as a kind of a theoretical comment, as social scientists would, but I just think it was a really bad choice of words, particularly given the context that's there. And I will tell you, it has caused deep hurt. It wasn't your intention to do that, but it has caused deep hurt. I think it has undermined the Housing Agency, because it kind of suggests that this body that advises government think there's a problem here, where in fact I think John O'Connor subsequently came out and said he doesn't believe there's a problem in a subsequent interview. And you're absolutely right. I think we should be evidence-based. And if you or your organisation have evidence to suggest that this is actually a problem, then we have a conversation. But again, the one publication we have access to, and we had to get it by FOI, doesn't present it, and that's why I think we're in difficulty on this particular remark. And I would just like you to kind of reflect on some of that and come back to me on it.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy O'Brien. Measured as ever. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to open up those issues. Just try and take them in the correct order. I think the first thing, I suppose, is to just home in on the word your concern about crossing a line in terms of my role in the agency. The first thing to bear in mind is I'm chairman of the board. I'm not a member of staff. My job as chair, our job as the board, is to challenge our executive. Sometimes to say, well done. Sometimes to say, try harder. Sometimes to say, look harder. I teach, and one of these issues, which is the one you're coming up with here, which is the absence of evidence. Absence of evidence is a very specific thing we teach our students. There's an old phrase that the absence of evidence is sometimes not the same thing as evidence of absence. And the way you teach the students that is you give them the example, which is that we're in a room, you send one of the students to the window, you look out into the lawn and you say, is there an elephant on the lawn? And they come back and say, there's no elephant on the lawn. Excellent, well observed. Say to the next student, over to the window now and tell me if there's ants on the lawn. And the student comes back and says, well, I don't know, I can't see any. Well, maybe you need to go out and look harder. This is the category of argument I'm putting to you here. The agency, and in my role as agency, as the man said, people send me stuff. So I'm going to read in maybe 3 or 4 examples from different aspects of stuff that people send me that gives me the grounds for saying exactly the remark that you're so concerned about. And if they are true, we all should be concerned about it. And if they're not true, we should all be relieved that they're not true, because they are precisely that class of data which you refer to as anecdote. No basis for policy. So we're both in complete agreement.
Before you read that out, that there's no names or that anything can be attributed to anybody.
I have, I'm just holding them up generally, I have blacked out anything that could identify anybody. I will make these available to the clerk to make sure this is clear. Not in any particular order. So one strand of evidence is social media. Through another business I have, I'm in the business of watching and seeing what takes place in social media. And one of the relatively common things we're coming across is group chats, where people are sharing information with each other about how to improve their condition. So here's a sample. This is a sample I'm giving you. So they just a very short little snap. And people are talking about what they can do or can't do to get into housing. And the exact quote is, of course you can. It's up to yourself. Meaning get yourself into the list. And this woman who's or claims in this note to be in emergency accommodation says it's hard, but it be worth it. I'm on it with 3 kids, and by God it's hard, but I'll stick it out. I'll stick it out to get my forever home. You should think strongly about it. Your forever home. This is meeting minutes from Fingal County Council last Tuesday the 16th. Item number 5, housing numbers. Is this okay? This is an official record.
Some of the minutes of meeting, is it?
It's an official record.
And it's out in the public record?
It's in the public record, and I have taken the care forensically to check this with the Chief Executive, Paul Reid, that's in order for me to deliver this. Okay. Is that completely clear? Question, Councillor K. Redmond, A10400417, that the Chief Executive reports how many of those currently counted on Fingal's homeless housing list have been offered an accommodation option and turned it down. Please provide the answer with an up-to-date total number on the list for comparison. Reply. There are 7,961 housing applicants on the council's housing list, with 413 families deemed to be homeless or at risk of homeless. 68 offers of accommodation were refused in 2017. 36 of which related to applicants in homeless circumstances. So that's specific. This is the type of stuff that Deputy Bryn rightly demands that we base our decisions on. Third item, which again I will give to you, this is one where I've been specifically told I can use this person's name, and I've specifically checked with the county manager that it's in order. It's a county councillor's name, and it's specifically addressed to me, and I've specifically been told I can use it at this. So is that acceptable? I won't read the person's name out just now.
It's in the public domain already, is it?
No, it's not. This person has sent it to me. So out of an abundance of caution.
Name off it.
Fine. Yeah. Well, in that case, what I'll do is I'll synopsise it, because we don't have a huge amount of time, but essentially they say that there are 3 case studies that would be of assistance on the basis of personal experience of councillor. Now again, to be really clear, I went back and checked this with the county manager afterwards. And the county manager confirmed that these are the case. Case number 1, a young woman who had been living with her father in council accommodation contacted me in the latter half of last year. A problem arose. Her father had no permission to be allowed to stay with him. She found herself becoming homeless and contacted myself and other councillors in our electoral area. The problem was resolved, and the council advised that she could remain living with her father. She was most disappointed at this. Because of the difficulty with her father, he would no longer allow her to live with him. The council agreed to provide emergency accommodation in a nearby hotel. She only stayed in the hotel room for 1 week and then moved back to her family home, and now uses the hotel room to meet her partner a few nights a week, but as far as she's concerned, she's now living in emergency accommodation. The lady is counted on our housing figures when nothing could be further from the truth. This is the information I'm being sent. I would be remiss, Cathaoirleach, in my role if I did not challenge my executive to find out, is this true? Case 2, a young lady approached me 2 years ago and she told me she was homeless and sleeping in her car with her 3 children under the age of 7. She'd been living in a council house with her father and claimed he was being physically abusive to her, and her partner said they had to leave the home. I asked, could she stay with her mother, who's in another council house close by? She told me she had not spoken to her mother in years and there was no chance of getting her mother to agree to this. I attended the council meeting with her partner and her children. It was impossible for the meeting to be held because the children were very noisy. I arranged a meeting the following day. To my surprise, she called her mother, who arrived in the car and took the children home and arranged with her daughter to see her at the house later. When I questioned her about this, she told me in relation to her mother that she'd been told that this was the best way for her to enter emergency accommodation. She had a council house 6 months later. This is what I am being told. This is what I'm being asked to draw to your attention. Case number 3, some months back, at the launch of yet another fundraising drive by a homeless charity, I watched a video of a young child struggle with steps on a bed and breakfast because he was in temporary accommodation. It was an appalling sight and one that was viewed over 500,000 times on YouTube. When I realised this child was a member of a homeless family from Fingal, I approached our executive and sought an explanation as to how this was happening in our watch. It was only then I learned that this family had been offered alternative accommodation, including a brand new 3-bedroom specially adopted home in a new development. And it was refused because it was a 10-minute bus journey from where they'd hoped to secure a home. The same family also refused a transfer to a hotel nearby where they could have had a room adapted for people with special needs. But this was not close enough to her mother's home. Now, this next piece, to the heart of looking for evidence harder. When the facts of this case were brought to me by RTE and the Irish Independent, they both investigated and confirmed the story, both indicating they were anxious to run it. They both then reverted and advised to me it was too dangerous legally to deal with this story. I won't deal with the rest of it.
I think that answers your evidence question. What was your next question there, Owen?
Let me respond to that because, and this is very important, and in some senses I'm even more concerned now than I was at the start, Conor. And again, I'm going to be as measured as I can here. So first of all, third-party accounts of very complex family situations aren't evidence. And I'm not disputing that the person who sent you those emails may believe that, but that is not evidence of people gaming the system. That's somebody's interpretation of a set of circumstances. I mean, your first quote, for example, of a young woman in social media, none of us know from that account, was this person made homeless from a notice to quit from a landlord? Was there abuse in the family relationship or family circumstances? And the implication is that somehow, and I was on a radio show recently talking about this, and I think a very similar social media post was used by an interviewer. The implication was this person isn't really genuinely in there when that's clearly not evidenced from the information that you've given. But I go back to what I say. You see, I hear all the time all sorts of things. I hear a mother with 1 child can easily get a 3-bedroom house in the local authority area in which I live. It's not true. And I go and check whenever I'm told, and I look at the complexity of the situation, I realise. But what I also want to say to you is, when somebody presents as homeless, and you should know this given your position, there's a very rigorous test. There is documentation required. They engage with professional local authority staff at the front line who make very difficult decisions every day to allocate very limited volumes of emergency accommodation. And if we're suggesting that even one family gets through that, we're suggesting that a wrong call was made by one of those staff. Likewise, if somebody is in emergency accommodation, and if they don't stay in that emergency accommodation of a single night, that emergency accommodation is taken away from them straight away by the local authority, the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive. I have no difficulty with somebody who might be in a B&B and hotel going back and staying with family and friends for some relief, and because in fact many of these emergency accommodation locations you can't spend the day there. There is nothing in what you've said that provides any evidence of gaming the system. It does say that there are, particularly the councillor that you mentioned and whoever the other individual who presented you, think there's a problem. All I'm saying is this is your organisation's report. They looked at the matter, and while they said that there may be a problem, they provided no evidence for it. And what I would say to you is if you're concerned that the housing agency's report isn't good enough, in the first instance, it should be your responsibility to get the housing agency to do proper research and produce a new report. But when you come out as the chair of the agency, and you're right, I understand the role of the board chair, but you are perceived to be a spokesperson for that organisation, because the ordinary punter on the street doesn't know the difference between a board member and a CEO and whatever else. And when you say the words gaming the system, even though there's a caveat before, that sends out a signal that there's a big problem here. And nothing what you've said suggests that there is a problem. There may be, there are some people who think there are, there's some speculation or whatever. So I just think it was incredibly ill-advised. And I say that with the greatest of respect to you. And I would ask you, in the period of time that you're left in the chair, to please, particularly given the vulnerability of families who are in emergency accommodation, particularly given the hard work of local authority staff and NGO staff working at the front line, please be thoughtful in how you use these words, because for a social scientist in a university lecture, most of what you said is fine. Back out in the world of families dealing with homelessness and workers dealing with the stress of trying to respond adequately, those same rational, logical social scientist conversations can be deeply hurtful and can feed into a narrative that, in fact, a lot of these people are in there just trying to short-circuit a long housing waiting list and are turning down properties. And this is my final point. I don't have a difficulty with someone turning down an offer of accommodation if the reasons are legitimate. If they are legitimate. And nothing in what you said has given me any facts from the original source that those refusals might not have been legitimate. I have dealt with two homeless families, one homeless family in particular, and I fought with them tooth and nail, because the offers of accommodation they were given, a family with special needs, were so wholly inappropriate for those families that, in fact, I think the council made a mistake. The council eventually agreed, and they were eventually put in long-term accommodation appropriate to their needs. So again, we need to be careful that we don't feed unintentionally a whole set of very, very prejudicial narratives out there about what's going on. And I think if those few emails and posts are the basis of you making the claim, I think that's very disappointing, Conor, particularly given the fact that you're a very smart man who understands the need for evidence, and your own organisation, who's done a report, hasn't provided any. That'll be my last comment on the matter, Chair.
Deputy, thank you very much for raising up the opportunity to address the most important of those points, which is that the report that he's alluding to was prepared 2 years ago. It was prepared because our main client group, the Housing Authorities of Ireland, as soon as the new initiative came out to allocate the proportion of social housing to homeless as was laid out, we immediately had red flags raised the length and breadth of the country by our client housing authorities, saying that this could unwittingly give rise to people seeking to move from a conventional housing list into an accommodation list. So you will agree that that's the time we're talking about. Deputy O'Brien, as ever, is correct. There was no evidence at that time that this was occurring. And that's why no evidence was included in that report. Because the agency were doing what we are supposed to do, which is to send up red flags into the system to say there's a potential problem here, be aware of it. That was the agency doing its job. And to the department and the minister's credit, they did something about it almost immediately. Okay, so that's a very important thing that he's raising, and there's a reason that that report did not have the materials in it. In the matter of vigorous scrutiny, the next piece of evidence is similarly from one of these social media sites. And this is why we need to look for something other than elephants. This is why it may be so difficult to spot the ants. This one says the following. Hi there. Sorry, it's got a heading on it called a non-post. Hi there. I'm a social welfare inspector and was wondering if you could have this post anonymous in the group.
Because I have to make sure we remain orderly, relevant and fair, and that alludes to somebody's job, so we might be best if you don't proceed with that one.
Okay, fine.
And we might just stick with the report that Deputy O'Brien was talking about, and the rate of refusals that you mentioned there, have we a reason behind those refusals? Is that evidence given?
All I have is the evidence given in the manager's formal response on the 14th of June,
But it was
or this
within,
January.
So for anybody who's watching, when people are offered a home, whether it's suitable or not, it is normally in their preferred location, as in their first location that they're offered. And it is a 1, a 2, a 3 bed, whatever they have applied for. And once it's in accordance with what they have applied for and they have refused it and it's in the preferred area, they're the stats and the rationale that we need to understand why they're refusing them.
And again, I'd say the same thing, that that's the type of evidence we need to bring out.
Yeah. Okay.
Clarification. Emergency offers of accommodation when somebody's in homeless accommodation aren't made on the same basis. So that very, very often somebody will be offered accommodation not in their area of preference, but so far away from their area of preference and family support networks that it is not an appropriate offer, and that's an important distinction to make. And increasingly, for example, my own local authority has 2 areas of choice, so it's not like people get to choose a housing estate. You either have north of the Nace Road or south of the Nace Road. So that's why, for example, there are occasions where somebody's in emergency accommodation, they get an offer of accommodation, but when you look at the details of the family and the offer, it is wholly inappropriate. So it's not that they're choosing to turn something down. It does not meet often very complex and important needs and family support networks of those individuals. That's just...
And the evidence and data that the committee probably should proceed, just in order for us to inform policy going forward, that we have that kind of information, albeit it's a minority situation, but that kind of evidence would help with policy going forward. Was there any questions you didn't have answered there, Owen?
Just one very small point, yes. Conor's absolutely right, the report was 2016, and the logic of the report was there was a dramatic rise in the increase in families presenting as homeless. What Conor didn't mention, but I'm sure it was an oversight, that was also the period of time where we had a dramatic increase in the number of landlords increasing rents, but before we had an adequate response from government, so there was a crisis in the rental sector. The consequence of that report, notwithstanding the fact that no evidence was provided for strategic presenters, was that the 50% priority allocation was allowed to lapse. And in all 4 of the Dublin local authorities, the 50% dropped, some to 20, some to 25, some to 30. What's very important to state for the record is the number of families presenting as homeless, notwithstanding that the original suspicion that led to the calling for the report, the rise, continued to rise despite the fact that the priority system fell. And of course that was because of the rental crisis continuing to spiral out of control. We're now in a situation where many local authorities who have never applied a priority allocation system are seeing very dramatic rises in family homelessness. Now, none of that is conclusive evidence, but all of that is very important context to actually say the suggestion, and it's only a suggestion contained in the 2016 report, that there is a link between the number of family presenters and the availability of a 50% priority allocation is not only not conclusive, but it's counterproved by the fact that those increasing levels continued after the withdrawal of the 50% in Dublin and in those counties that have never had a priority allocation. So just a general point.
Bring Deputy Barry in and you might answer with Deputy Barry.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to ask Mr. Skehan about what his presentation described as recently articulated views. And I had intended to focus on recently articulated views about homelessness being normal, comments made last year, and about gaming the system, comments made last year. But I am now going to ask about articulated views that are far more recent than that, because I actually think that what you have said, Mr. Skehan, in this room in the last 30 minutes is not only continuing down the path of your normal comments and your gaming the system comments, but actually have brought things to an even more serious point than we were when the invitation to attend this committee was first invited to you, sent to you. I've listened to the examples that you've listed there, and I have heard scraps of information. I have heard hearsay. I have not heard anything that would constitute real, hard, serious evidence that would stand up the line of argument that you're making here. I have heard people who are in very difficult and vulnerable positions being wheeled out as examples. You mentioned not one, but two young women who are in difficult relationships with their father, one of whom the issue of physical abuse was part of the issue. You have done it whilst engaged in a particular action, and that action is to defend your position from the criticism that you've received in recent times. And I think the effect of your comments is to add fuel to the fire of a narrative that is out there, that's pushed by sections of the right-wing media, the old Victorian idea that we have the deserving poor on the one hand and the undeserving poor on the other hand. And I think your comments actually add fuel to the fire of prejudice and backward attitudes towards people who find themselves in a very difficult position within our society. I'd like to deal with some of the specific points that you raised. I'll just look at my notes here briefly. Yeah, the question of the minutes of Fingal County Council. 68 offers refused, 36 from people in homeless services.
Circumstances.
Homeless circumstances, yeah. I think anyone here who's a public representative, who's worked as a TD or has worked in a local authority as a councillor, that figure would not be a shocking figure. We deal with people in those circumstances all the time, and there can be any number of good reasons that will stand up why someone who is in a homeless circumstance would refuse an offer of a house, right? I had many debates on my old council in Cork City Council where there were Conservative politicians who said this woman wouldn't accept an offer because it was too far away from her mother, and they make a big issue of that. And the reason they make a big issue of it is that they live in a different world from someone who is a lone parent on a low income, in a stressful situation, trying to improve their situation by getting a part-time job, going out to work, getting a few bob together, but can't afford a babysitter. They need support from relatives and families. And people who don't live in communities like that, people who live in a different world, a more affluent world, don't understand that these are the realities of life for many people who are working class people with low incomes and so on and so forth. I've seen people turn down an offer of a house because there is someone who lives across the road from the house or around the corner from the house who has been threatening or violent towards them in the past, who is perhaps a known drug dealer in the area that that person has had difficulties with in the past. These are the realities of life for many people, and I suspect there's people high up in government, in the civil service, and with respect in the housing agency who don't understand the realities of life that people are struggling with in issues such as this. In terms of the examples that you gave about people with difficult situations with their fathers and physical abuse, actually, in my experience, difficult family situations show the opposite than a narrative that there are people who are gaming the system, right? For example, how many times have I come across this one? A relationship or a family unit breaks down. The people move back in with a mother or a father. That house is then overcrowded. There are tensions. The tensions become unbearable. The people present as homeless. The reason given is family breakdown. Are they gaming the system? They've been evicted. They've been subject to huge rent hikes. In fact, they tried to do the exact opposite. They tried to avoid having anything to do with the system. But yet, what do they get? Do they get help? Do they get assistance from your comments? No. They perceive that they're at the butt end of a cruel job. Now, you might say, they're not the people that you're talking about, right? You said today that it was a tiny, tiny percentage of people. It may be an issue. If I was to walk out on the plinth and say that I think there may be corruption in the cabinet, and then I was to qualify my comments by saying that it may be an issue, or it's a tiny, tiny percentage of cabinet members, I know that that wouldn't be the headline in the newspapers tomorrow, because I've been around the block. I've a little bit of experience in terms how the media, sections of the media operate, and the way in which comments are taken up. You're the chair of the housing agency.
Just to give you a chance, you're clearly not suggesting that. I'm just saying it to you.
I wouldn't dream of making a suggestion such as
I'm
that.
being very serious now.
Yeah.
You're clearly not suggesting anything.
I'm clearly not suggesting that even a tiny, tiny percentage
Thank you.
of the cabinet.
I'm just reminding that witnesses are expected to be treated fairly and with respect and consideration, and at all times are protected by absolute privilege, and that works both ways for the committee members too. So
I know.
I'm just reminding the members.
But Chair, I think you know what I'm saying, and I think you know that I'm
not
making
agreeing
a...
with anything you just said there. I'm being impartial here, and I'm trying to protect the members, and I'm protecting the witnesses, that everybody is protected by absolute privilege in here. And that's all I'm reminding you of. Do you want Mr. Skehan to answer your question?
I'll finish my point and then ask him to reply. Thank you. I'm merely using an extreme example to make a point. Right? The chair of the housing agency should know better. The chair of the housing agency should know how his comments will be taken up. And I have to say, I'll be blunt with you, I suspect that you did know. I think you did know how those comments would be taken up, and I think that there are people who are high up in this country, high up in politics and high up in the government, who like that narrative of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. It's a divide and rule narrative, it's a Tory narrative. You're being called out on it. And the comments that you've made today are at least as bad, if not worse, than the comments you made previously, and are grounds in and of themselves to ask for your resignation, which the Minister should ask you to do, but he won't, because I think you're playing quite a useful role for the government. I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Skehan.
Okay, thank you. I suppose start at the end and work back. The person you're describing who said it's a tiny, tiny percentage was Father Peter McFerry. I didn't say that. The person who said a tiny proportion was Mr. David Hall. I didn't say that. I was very careful in the words I used, which was to say if it were happening, it might be in one or two constituencies only. I'm careful with my words. In terms of the deserving and undeserving poor, it's the opening slide in my lecture that I give people about housing. Housing is one of the things I teach in DIT, and I specifically draw attention to the potential for this to be kidnapped or hijacked by people who want to use it for socially divisive means. So I'm well aware of the potential for hurt. I'm well aware of the potential for people to feel defamed or otherwise injured by these. But I am not saying this to comment on the 400 or 600 people in Fingal. I am saying this for the 85,000 people who are on our housing waiting list. The 85,000 people who, to use the words of Father Peter McFerry, may actually find themselves having a queue jumped. Okay, I'm not even going to talk about what happens when you start the business of identity politics, of saying you're in my group or the other. The whole point of drawing attention to this is the housing agency's remit is all of housing, everything in housing, and that's everybody who's in need of social housing, and to make sure that everybody who's in social housing is treated fairly and is given a fair opportunity. That's the concern of the agency, is the 100% and not the 1% causing a distortion. That's the words that's used in the application of social policy. It's the 85,000 that I'm worried about. In terms of, as you say, defending my position, far from it. I have literally nothing to lose. I'm in here to defend those 85,000. I'm in here to make those statements to make sure that the majority of people who are entitled to and whom we as a society should be very proud of are provided with social housing, are dealt with equitably and fairly. We're a fantastically good country. We deal with people who are in need. When we get out into the business of proportion and we look at some states of the United States where a significant proportion of the population of the entire state live in trailer homes, that's the kind of thing we can and should be proud of, is the 100,000 units of social accommodation that we provide every year. Can always do better. We have a list of 85,000. It's down from 91,000 last year to 85,000 this year. It's going the right direction. It will never be good enough. It will never be good enough.
On a point of information, just a point of clarification.
No, Deputy Barry, he didn't interrupt you, so just let him finish his remarks and I'll let you back in. I've no problem letting you back in.
So the point is that we are dealing with the majority of the people who are in those circumstances to make sure that the system is worked as equitably, efficiently and fairly as possible, and to make sure that the needs of all of the people who are entitled to and who we should be proud of are provided with social housing get what they're entitled to and get it as efficiently as possible. That's who we're all serving. That's it.
Great. Deputy Barry, clarification.
Yes. I would like Mr. Skean to clarify his comments about hundreds of thousands of people living in trailer parks in various states in the United States of America. That is not the position here, and that it's...
That's not what he said.
That's the clarification.
I'll ask Mr. Skean to clarify.
Sorry, if I could just finish my point, Chair, right? Yeah. I haven't finished asking my question. I took it from what Mr. Skean said, is that we should be proud of the fact that we don't have that scenario here. And I'm asking him, does he think it's appropriate, as Chair of the Housing Agency, at a time when we've got more than 8,000 in emergency accommodation, including a record 3,000 plus children, that he's saying that we should be proud that we don't have hundreds of thousands of people living in trailer parks like in the United States? That's an incredible comment. Really is. It's an offensive comment.
I'll ask him to clarify, but that is not what I took from your comments, Mr. Skean, if you want to clarify that.
Deputy Barry is correct. A housing list is a normal means of allocating social housing. It's a system like a conveyor belt. People come onto it and move off it. We would like people to be on it for as little time as possible, we as a society, and we would like there to be as few people on it as possible as a society. That is a normal way of allocating resources. You are absolutely correct. None of us should be proud of the fact that we've got people in emergency accommodation in this country. It's called emergency for a reason. It means that aspect of the system is not working. And I would not like for a second to anyone record or understand or believe that I think that is in any way normal or acceptable. And all of us have got to try to increase our endeavours to make sure that that particular category is removed as quickly as possible. There isn't a hair's breadth of difference between us and that, Deputy.
Thank you. Thank Mr. Skean for coming before the committee and seeking to clarify the comments that he made, or the context in which he made them and the way in which they were interpreted. Insofar as my reaction to the comment about gaming the system and the subsequent comments that we've heard today, the Minister is where the buck stops from an accountability perspective. And when he said in the public domain that there was no evidence to suggest that, I'll accept his word and leave it at that, if that's okay. In relation to the homelessness being normal and the right and the expectation and to investigate the situation in other countries and to compare and contrast our figures as against theirs. I see there's nothing wrong with doing that. There could be a lot to gain from doing that, but I'd simply ask that when the comparison is made, that you qualify that comparison with like figures, insofar as the methodology in the way in which figures are compiled in some countries differ than the way they're compiled here, and it might suit some quarters to give the impression that it's all done in a similar way, and therefore you can say it's normal. That's far from the case, and I wish you could acknowledge that, and so as that's clarified too. Just two other issues, and they relate to another point that you made altogether, and I don't think it was even in the context of that interview that you mentioned, or the articles that you mentioned. You said at one stage that the point at which starts a crisis and the one thing that makes them worse is data being produced by people who have skin in the game. We now have people saying we need up to 50,000 houses a year, and that is rubbish. That was the quote. You now see the likes of Davies, Goodbodies, the American Chamber of Commerce, and they put the figure that's required to meet the demand at 40 to 50,000. The ESRI says 35 to 40. The only organisation that believes the demand is 20 to 25 appears to be the Housing Agency. So I would ask you to reiterate your confidence in that figure being the one to which we should aspire to, rather than the 50,000. Finally, can you confirm that you acted in an advisory capacity to Phil Hogan while he was in opposition? And if so, do you believe that the scale of that involvement with that party in some way colours your viewpoints in public statements? I'd imagine not, but you need to clarify that. And in doing so, I think you could acknowledge that it is open to that connection being drawn upon, and can consequently lead to the assertion that Deputy Barry referred to. And it's understandable if that assertion is made on foot of that connection.
And this, sorry, just to clarify the last part, if that's okay.
The assertion about the undeserving poor.
Oh, yes, okay.
And it'd be, okay.
That's your final question.
Yeah.
Mr. Skehan.
You have the gift of brevity, so you've packed a lot into those 5 questions, so I'll do the best I can to get back in the correct order. Correct me if I leave anything out. In the matter of no evidence, you're absolutely correct. The Department of the Minister said they've no evidence of it. Our advice back to the Minister is the elephant in the ant one. Look harder, Minister. That's our job, to give independent, objective advice and to tell people things they don't want to hear. That's the Minister's position. He says, I say things he may not agree with or like. That's my job, to call the shots as I see them. End of? That's that one. That's clear. Question number 2, normalising homelessness. I can do nothing except agree with you. I think it's a very important point that you've made, which is that using international comparisons as benchmarks is absolutely riven through with difficulties of having comparators across the line. And as public commentary has been made, particularly by advocates for the housing charities, that some countries, for instance, count people couch surfing as being homeless. Some people count someone living beyond a certain amount of time with their parents as being homelessness. And it is a problem that bedevils the system. You're absolutely correct. And again, one of the things we're pointing out is the need for us to have access to those types of international comparators. So no game, no contest. You're absolutely correct.
You agree that nobody should infer that our crisis, and it is a crisis, is normal, and back that up with fact-based evidence that is built on sand?
No, that statement is a misconstrual of what I've just said. There are major housing crises in every major European country at this point in time. If I could bring you in the cover of the Frankfurter Zeitung, you would see that homelessness is a huge crisis in German cities. We all can speak English. We can read the English newspapers at the moment. Theresa May 2 weeks ago said she was giving a priority to dealing with homelessness above dealing with Brexit. That's how big it is in Britain. Okay? It's a huge issue all over Europe for more or less the same suite of reasons. We're not unique. So be a little bit careful about having mixing the two things. I am agreeing with you completely that there is a need for a standardised way of examining it. But I am not agreeing with you that our levels of homelessness are out of step. And if you think they are difficult in Europe, you'd want to go to a few major cities of the United States.
I don't doubt that, but I was elected.
Staggering.
I was elected to Laois Offaly, and that's my priority, and I have a responsibility as a spokesperson for my party from a national perspective.
Come back to that one. So point taken. We're not disagreeing about that. The next one, data, skin in the game. One of the most certain ways to bring about a housing crisis is to have an oversupply of unwanted dwellings. I shouldn't have to go into any more detail in this particular chamber as to how that has affected the country of Ireland. In 2008, we built 98,000 units in Ireland. As a result of the oversupply, the market for housing dried up. People who had borrowed money to buy and build those lost their money to such a degree that this country experienced one of the most catastrophic falls ever experienced by a Western European democracy. The primary cause is inaccurate data that is not delivered on time. The mechanism for bringing about a collapse of a housing market is people continuing to invest in a market long after the demand has dried up. The agency have specifically been mandated by the government to produce an annual housing needs assessment. And we do it every year because of the complexity of housing and those changing numbers. Our current estimate is certainly between 20 and 25,000 per annum. And we are, and poor old Conal McQuilla, that's not said badly, but the Davies and those types of people and myself argue long and hard about the lack of wisdom of people making excessive projections as to what the housing supply should be. And I won't name any of the people that you mentioned a few minutes ago who produced projections, but they are all the same people who told us we were going to have a soft landing. They're all the same people who told us.
The ESRI don't have skin in the game.
Oh, they certainly do. Reputational.
We need to be careful here.
Yeah. So just going back to the single point of information, point of fact, the Housing Agency have a specific remit from the government to produce a housing needs assessment, which we do every single year. And I would plead with the committee.
Stand over your 20 to 25,000.
Absolutely.
I don't agree with you, but we'll agree to differ.
Well, we don't do that on the basis of opinion, we do it on the basis of rigour.
Well, I do it, and my colleagues do it on the basis of the representations we get.
Okay, fine. We'll move on. We're not going to agree on that particular one. We've talked about the ESRI one, and then, the Phil Hogan one. That's an amazing one. Yes, I confirm that for many years when they were in opposition, I would provide advice to the Fine Gael party generally about matters to do with the environment, planning, all that kind of stuff. And it is the really exciting time in politics. I mean, the poor parties who are in government, they're stuck with defend, deliver, and announce. The really sweet time. I mean, I've been around this game for most of my adult life. The really sweet time in politics is when you're opposition and you have the time to think and talk and explore and develop new ideas. That's the really exciting time. I have no apologies to make for enjoying that so much. I have advised Jim Mitchell and Avril Doyle, and the list is as long as your arm. And the last one, just as they went into power, was Phil Hogan, certainly. Yes, absolutely. In terms... That's a matter of public record. Absolutely nothing to apologise about that. Whether that means that you can associate that, and I presume by that you mean Fine Gael, and I presume by Fine Gael you mean a party that would certainly be to the right rather than the left of politics. Is that your implication? I think that's a separate matter altogether. I think in terms of my role as chair of the Housing Agency, I would again repeat our duty is towards the majority, and in particular to the majority who may not have as much skin in the game as those people who have imagined access to power and money. We have to be the voice of the voiceless, and that's what I'm trying to do here today, to make sure that every single one of the people who are on the social housing waiting list are treated equally, and that there's no distortion in that. That's the reason I'm here, and that's the reason I make those statements, and I have no apology to make for doing that.
You don't have any apology. If you had, you wouldn't be in the position. You'd be resigning forthwith.
I have a couple of questions for Deputy Byrne. You have a clarification you want to come in on, is it? Or
No, a supplementary question, but if you want to go ahead, I'll come in after you.
Yeah, it's just a couple of questions. And obviously the main meeting has been around a couple of comments that were made before Christmas. Unfortunately, I think you've well addressed those. I wanted to focus in more of the work of the Housing Agency and the role that they have in delivery in housing supply services. You mentioned there that our social housing list has gone down from 91,000 people to 85,000 in the last year. I don't think that, I obviously know that, and the members probably know that, but good news stories like that never obviously hit the press. I want to know how you support local authorities in the roles, their management functions. I'd like a little bit more information around that.
Part of that?
How you support local authorities in their housing management functions.
Yeah.
Also in supporting AHBs, in what way do you support them? In what role do you support them? I'd like more information around the mortgage to rent scheme. I know it was slow to get off the ground, but obviously you've had good success in recent time in that area, and it's something that I think we want to explore much further and put more emphasis on in that area. And I think it's getting to the root of the problem more so than dealing with the symptoms. So I'd like to hear more about the mortgage to rent scheme, the role that you have in the regulation of approved housing bodies, and what's coming down the line. Deputy Byrne might want more information on that as well. We have a meeting coming up on the reclassification of approved housing bodies, just your views around that. And there's a couple of supplementaries. If I have time, I'll ask after. But do you want to ask a couple of questions at the same time?
I'll just throw them in quickly here. And data accuracy is one of those things that we talk about a lot here. The recently announced government housing needs assessment figures that 80,000+ is for June or July this year. I have subsequent figures, or sorry, June or July of last year, should I say. I have subsequent figures from every local authority under FOI of the same net need figures from September, and they're 99,000. So I wouldn't get too excited that there's been as big a drop as they say. What I would also say, however, is we have 32,000 households on HAP, which is a short-term response to their particular housing situation. We've 20,000 households on RAS. So you could argue that we have a gross housing need of about 130,000. The reason I'm saying that is because all of us in here represent all of those people in our constituencies. I'm in a constituency where we've over 4,000 households on the waiting list just for Dublin Midwest, and maybe 200 to 2,500 families in emergency accommodation. So we all absolutely want to ensure the system is fair. It's also important to emphasise a significant majority of those people who exit emergency accommodation don't go into a council house. In fact, if you look at the most recent data, the majority of them go back into the private rental sector through the housing assistance payment. So just in case anybody listening or watching thinks that people are automatically getting access to council houses. It's also important to stress, if you look at Focus Ireland's most recent research via the intake team, because they have the data, that the key driver of families into homelessness is notices to quit. That the rental crisis is still driving. And whereas the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive has said that family breakdown is the largest reason, they've only asked people what was the last address they have. The Focus Ireland go back 3 addresses. So a large number of those families who were coming from family breakdown got a notice to quit, chose not to go down the homeless route because they understand the grave difficulties for them and their children, went into family accommodation that was unsustainable. I only want to say those things because they're all kind of counter evidences to the theory that some people think that there is a gaming of the system. My one question is this: given that you strongly believe that the 2016 report from the Housing Agency is out of date, Can you tell me at what point you put in a formal request to the housing agency to do a further study based on the anecdotal information that you were getting?
Have I any further questions? Because we'll be coming near time. Pat or Barry, Mick coming in. You're okay, Mick?
Thanks, Chair. It's just a very brief question. Mr. Skean, you provided the committee with a variety of information and sources to back up the idea that there's questions, at least, about people gaming the system. Some of that information was from sources related to social media. And I think, I stand to be corrected on this, but I think you indicated that you were involved in some other operation, some other business, and you'd obtained some of this information in the course of that business, monitoring social media or something like that, and then you provided us with the anecdotes. Can you tell the committee what is the other business exactly that you're involved in that gave you access to this information, and do you think it was appropriate that it would be shared in this forum today?
I'll also ask Mr. Skean, any evidence that you think is relative to this committee, obviously leaving names off it, if you think it's beneficial to us in forming policy that we're going to make as a committee, I'd ask that you might send it and we can circulate it to the members if that's suitable.
Okay. Is it okay with everybody if I take the Cahill questions first, go to Deputy Bryn, then Deputy Barry, in that order, if that's okay? Okay, so starting at the beginning, the work of the agency with the AHBs and the local authorities runs a very broad spectrum. So it runs from giving them research, which we've heard about at the moment, giving practical support. So, for instance, when HAP was being introduced, we would have worked very closely with the local authorities, starting in Limerick City, out into Limerick County, out into etc., trying to find out what the flaws were in the system and correct them and move forward. It's a pretty good model, by the way, just for you as a committee, of introducing the HAP one. It's a very, very good model for introducing a new process coming from legislation where you don't assume the thing is going to be perfect on day one, and you gradually roll it out, find out what the problems in the system are, expand it, and when it eventually hits a place the size of Dublin, then you've actually experienced quite a lot of the issues that need to be resolved. They're never perfect, but I mean that's the type of role the housing agency work very closely. And in terms of work for the local authorities and the AHBs, you also work at the other end, at the financing end, helping people to secure financing, helping local authorities with sites that they may have acquired, and we look after those with them. With the AHBs, we also assist in again, I probably don't have to say this to this committee, but a lot of the stuff that really makes a difference with housing is really slow, boring stuff that nobody's interested, such as AHB regulation. So AHBs, being able to access international finance, one of the big problems for them is being able to show that they're monitored and supervised by somebody. So it was one of those really tedious bureaucratic things to set up the whole regulation and registration of AHBs and inspect and monitor and certify them, and that's done now. So that's the type of stuff we do as well. So we're helping them with direct money, with direct advice, but with the really subtle infrastructural work again. Also, the work of this committee here is to make sure that that type of really slow background work goes on, and the data gathering that I keep on talking about is part of that as well. So housing, the city manager in Dublin has this great phrase which he draws attention to. It's a phrase from social sciences called a wicked problem, and he says housing is a wicked problem. And wicked doesn't mean wicked like we'd say it in Dublin. Wicked means something where all of the parts are incredibly intertwined, and a change in one will affect the other. And so unfortunately your remit is to deal with that incredibly complex mixture of issues, all of which data, regulation, social attitudes, social expectations, national policy, all come together, and each one as they change affects the other. So we're trying to deal with those. So that's the AHB. In terms of each of those systems, again, going back to the mortgage to rent, the complexity of housing and the variety of expectations and demands are so vast that I think there's a huge lesson to be learned from that. And it kind of ties back in with Deputy O'Brien's question, which is that the reality is that there are three major strands of provision that go from the direct provision through to the HAS and the HAP and the RAS. And people will float in and out between those. You're absolutely right. They will be capable of having figures. It's not just it's the business about playing figures like this is something that is prone to being exploited. And Deputy Bryn is absolutely right to say we have to continue to look at the big picture and not fool ourselves, not to be complacent in terms of saying, look, the housing list is going down while ignoring the fact that something else is going up elsewhere. The likes of HAP and RAS, they may be there for other reasons. Those deputies from rural areas will know that housing assistance payment is not always for an apartment, it's not always for a house in an estate. Many houses in rural areas are paid for by housing assistance payments and for reasons to do with communities and what people want or not want to do in terms of admitting what their financial statements are. They'll avail of that. So it's a very, very complex issue over a very wide range of areas. I'm speeding up a little bit here because I see we're at 4:30 and I don't want to get between you and the end of your day. So I can come back in more detail, but the next one, to take Deputy Bryn's point, I think that, the point he's making about the reasons, about the complexity, the overlap between those three is absolutely correct. And I think just to amplify what he's saying there, the kind of work that you're doing in Focus Ireland is exactly the type of work that needs to be done. That complexity of realising that somebody, when they eventually reach a stage of presentation, if I can use that word, you often have to understand that somebody, for instance, may have had a problem in their family because prior to that they were moved to unsuitable or not large enough accommodation, which pushes a stress on a family. Is that a fair summary of what can sometimes happen? And then you're pushed in and it's a cascade down, and we need to do that type of work. We will all agree to disagree that the Eastern Region Homeless Executive study of the reasons for homelessness go into flux. They change from time to time, and all of this data is like something you write on water. It's changing all the time, and that's why it's not good enough to do studies once. And you're absolutely right about the need to ask the agency to go back and do a further study. These studies have to be done and then done again and then done again and again and again. We're never going to arrive at a situation of perfect data to make perfect decisions. So while on the one hand I'm saying Deputy Bryn is dead right to say we have to have evidence-led, the evidence will never give us all the answers. And going back to Deputy Cowan's point about, for instance, the international comparisons, you're also dead right about that. That's always going to change. It's always going to be in flux. All we can do is our best, run to catch up with where the data is, but we'll always be behind. So again, going back to the international housing comparisons, people had a field day saying that it was based on out-of-date information. Of course it's based on out-of-date information. It's census information, and census information covers a period of 2011 to 2016 or whatever it is. So you're always going to be running to catch up with census data. It's normal. It's tough. It's normal. We've got to make decisions and make brave decisions based on the best data that's available to us. So yes, going back to your question, your last question is, should a further study be called for? Yes.
My question was, when did you ask the housing agency to conduct a further study, given that you were of the view that the 26 study was out of date?
Yeah,
or are you saying you have never actually asked them to do that study?
Never asked the housing agency to do any studies. What we have is we have...
do you not think it would have been more appropriate to ask them before floating the idea publicly if you were dissatisfied with the 2016 report? Would that not have been more sensible as the chair of the body?
No, just to be really clear, we have, among other roles, a research function. We have a wonderful research officer, David Silk, and David presents the board with his research priorities for the coming 12, 18 months. And again, it's a rolling programme, and I wouldn't always agree with what David's priorities are, but that's David's job, is to tell us what he thinks we need to be looking at, and he presents them to us every year as a board, and we accept and move on with it. That's David's job, and he's really good at it.
Given your concern about the possibility of gaming the system, and giving your view that the 2016 report was out of date, and telling me that part of the job of the board is to challenge the agency, you had actually never asked the agency to conduct a follow-up report on this issue.
You want to see the list of things?
It's a yes or no question.
It's not a yes or no question. The list of things that we give poor old David every year, and they're basically in accordance with the priorities. Saying, David, what are you doing to study vacancy? David, what are you doing to study affordability? And the list is there, and they're the list. They're the list. And I think I gave you a copy of the list of priorities. There are priorities. Make no apologies for having priorities. That's good management. Give clear steer to the board.
No to my question.
Deputy Bryn, you're a scallywag. It's not a no to your question. And then, Deputy Barry, the social media stuff. I'm the chairman of an organisation or a company that helps people protect their reputations online. And in doing that, people who are involved in social media, they sign up for us, and we monitor what's called Risk Eye. We monitor what they do to see if they're getting in trouble, and if they are, to give them advice how to get out of it. And occasionally information like this gets what's called entrained. So you're watching a site because, say for instance, a beauty blogger is getting herself in trouble because she's made outrageous claims and people are giving out to her about it, and that kind of stuff crops up. It's called entrainment. It's entrained with a big long flow stuff you're looking at. Does that answer the question?
And the name of the company is?
Sorry, we actually...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. can't, because they're not here to spend
Advertise
stuff.
commercial products in the building.
Yeah.
Good point, Deputy Brin. Thank you.
So,
Well cautioned. Thanks,
Any
Gail.
further questions for Mr. Skehan? Okay. Can I thank Mr. Skehan for coming in? I don't think anybody could underestimate the passion that you have in this area. Can I thank you for the manner in which you came in and you answered all the questions that were put before you. If there is information that you think is relevant to this committee that we can make informed policy going forward, I would appreciate it as the chair, and then we could forward it on to the members, and it might actually inform our work programme as well into the future.
Subject to the advice of the clerk, because it's a sensitive issue, and if it's okay with you, I'll check that I've framed it correctly before doing so, if that's okay, just to make sure we're square.
And we'll possibly ask you to come in again if that's okay. A lot of information
the
there.
Minister assures me I'm going to be gone sooner rather than later. So I mean, my request to him was to relieve me of this burden, as I said a long time ago, and he assures me that it's going to happen sooner rather than later. So this may be the last time in front of you. And before I go, just to emphasise again that in the bloody lectures that I give the students, I point out these committees are the anvil of the Oireachtas. This is incredibly important work ye do. As we saw in the Rebuilding Ireland, the majority of the content of the Rebuilding Ireland document came out of this committee. So you guys have got to get it right. You've got to listen to Deputy O'Brien. You've got to have data. You've got to have evidence from the full spectrum of people. I'm sorry for that rant, but you've got to do it. The work is too important to be fed by anecdotes and emotions. It's way too important.
Thank you, Mr. Skehan. So can I thank you for your attendance today and wish you well. And can I thank the members for attending today as well. This meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Commission will be held on Thursday the 8th of February at 9:30 about the reclassification of approved housing agencies.